The abandoned storylines of House of the Dragon. Tonight we're stepping into the shadows of a story that most of the world already thinks it knows. House of the Dragon has given us dragons in the sky, kings on the Iron Throne, and a family tearing itself apart from the inside. But behind every scene that made it to air there is another scene that didn't. A wedding that was filmed and quietly buried. A war that lasted a decade in the pages of history and barely a single episode on screen. A girl who, according to the books, changed the entire meaning of what it means to be a dragon rider, and who never appears in the show at all. George R.R. Martin never wrote Fire and Blood as a conventional novel with one narrator and one truth. He wrote it as a history book, a chronicle supposedly compiled by a Meister long after the events took place, drawing on conflicting testimonies, rumors, and the fog of memory. 3 different accounts of the same event might all appear on the same page, each contradicting the other. That structure gives the book an unusual richness. It is less a single story than a debate about what actually happened. And at the center of that debate sits the bloodiest, most tragic chapter in Targaryen history, the Dance of the Dragons, a civil war fought over succession, pride, and the question of who truly deserves to sit the Iron Throne. When HBO set out to adapt this material, they were not adapting a screenplay. They were adapting a history book filled with holes, contradictions, and decades of quiet politics that had to be compressed into a handful of television seasons. That meant painful choices. Entire characters were removed. Entire wars were reduced to a single dramatic sequence. Milestones that took years to unfold in the source material were skipped over in the space of a single time jump. Some of what was lost simply fell away in the writing process. Other pieces were filmed, fully costumed and rehearsed, and then cut in the editing room, existing now only as a kind of ghost footage that will likely never be seen. Tonight we are going deep into both categories, the storylines that were written out and the ones that were shot and abandoned, to understand not just what the show became, but what it could have been. The time jump problem. To understand everything that follows, you first have to understand the single biggest structural decision the show made, the time jump. Rather than dramatizing the slow, grinding decades of King Viserys' reign in real time, the show compresses years into seconds. A scene ends with a baby in a cradle. The next scene begins with that baby fully grown, married, sometimes already a parent. 5 years disappear between 2 lines of dialogue. 10 years disappear between 2 episodes. In the book, the early reign of Viserys is textured with council meetings, diplomatic visits, marriage negotiations, and the slow accumulation of small resentments that eventually erupt into full-blown civil war. It is not a fast story. It is a story about how patience and pride, stretched out over decades, eventually snap. The show, working within the constraints of 8 to 10 episodes per season, chose to skip most of that slow burn. We see Viserys crowned. We see him aging. We see him on his deathbed. The years in between, the years where the actual seeds of the war were planted, are left as a blank space the audience is simply asked to imagine. This narrative shorthand works well enough for packing, but it comes at a real cost. Characters arrive on screen already fully formed, and we are left to take the writer's word for how they got there. We are told that years have passed. We are rarely shown what filled them, and nowhere is this more damaging than in the story of the war that made Daemon Targaryen who he was. The War for the Stepstones. The Stepstones are a chain of small, rocky islands sitting in the narrow sea between Westeros and the Free Cities, controlling the trade routes that merchant ships depend on. In the show, we see this conflict as a fairly brief, self-contained story. Daemon, restless and hungry for purpose, convinces Lord Corlys Velaryon to fund an expedition against the Triarchy, a loose confederation of 3 pirate city-states known as the Disputed Lands, and after a tense standoff, Daemon delivers a dramatic final blow against the pirate warlord known as the Crabfeeder. It's tense, it's cinematic, and then it's over. Daemon walks away having proven his skill as a warrior, and the show moves on. In the book, this is not a quick campaign. It is a brutal, grinding war that lasts roughly a decade, fought across multiple engagements with thousands of casualties on both sides. The Triarchy is not a single overconfident warlord who can be dealt with in one battle. It is an entrenched, resourceful coalition with its own fleet, its own shifting alliances, and its own political influence throughout the Free Cities. Daemon does not simply win. He spends years there, alternately winning and losing, learning to command, learning to endure long sieges and failed assaults, slowly building a reputation as both a warrior and a leader. At one point, having grown tired of waiting for reinforcements or official recognition from the crown, he even declares himself the self-styled King of the Narrow Sea, a title that in the book carries genuine political weight and genuine outrage back in King's Landing. In the show, this entire chapter of his life is compressed into a handful of scenes, and the title, when mentioned at all, feels like a passing boast rather than a serious claim that once destabilized the realm. What is lost here isn't just spectacle, it's characterization. The show gives us a demon who is already impulsive, already dangerous, already a skilled warrior the moment we meet him properly, but it never shows us the years of attrition that actually forged that version of him. We don't see the failed assaults that taught him patience. We don't see the moment he learned that charisma alone doesn't win wars. The show hints that he is capable, but it never really earns that reputation on screen the way the book does. There's a second casualty buried inside the same compression, the Triarchy itself. In the book, this pirate confederation isn't defeated and forgotten after the Stepstones campaign. They regroup, they rebuild, they return later in the war under a new and far more dangerous leader, Admiral Shirako Lohar, who plays a critical role in one of the war's most devastating personal tragedies. But because the show reduced the original Stepstones conflict to little more than a single victorious skirmish, when Lohar is introduced in Season 2, he arrives with almost no established context. The audience has no real reason to fear the Triarchy, because the war that should have established them as a persistent, dangerous threat was erased along with everything else. A villain who should feel inevitable instead feels like a new addition to the cast, introduced late and without the weight the book had spent years building. And finally, this compression quietly affects Lord Corley's Velaryon as well. In the book, financing this decade-long war strains the Valyrian treasury and tests Corley's patience with Daemon again and again. It is a source of real tension between the two men, born out of years of shared risk and shared frustration. In the show, it is a brief, low-cost adventure with almost no lasting consequences for their relationship. An entire dimension of their partnership, forged and tested over a decade of shared war, simply isn't there. The Lost Weddings. If the war for the Stepstones is the clearest example of a storyline erased through compression, the show's handling of two specific weddings is the clearest example of something else entirely: deliberate, careful deletion. The first is a wedding that actually exists somewhere, fully filmed, on an HBO hard drive. In the finished first season, we never see the ceremony that unites King Viserys I and Alicent Hightower. We see only the aftermath, a quiet, tense conversation in the Queen's chambers, Viserys presenting Alicent with a Valyrian steel dagger, and the awkward, unspoken distance already growing between them. What we don't see is that the production shot a full wedding sequence, traditional Targaryen rites, a hall full of finely dressed guests, vows exchanged in front of the realm's most powerful lords. It was cut entirely before the season aired. Why remove something that had already been fully produced? The reasoning that has circulated is largely about packing. The showrunners reportedly wanted to keep the narrative momentum focused on the political fallout of the marriage, the shifting balance of power at court, rather than pause for an extended ceremonial sequence. A lavish wedding, however beautifully shot, would have slowed the story down at a moment when the writers wanted tension to keep building. But consider what that decision cost the story. In the book, this wedding is not a private affair. It is described as a genuine public spectacle. A procession through the streets of King's Landing, 7 days of feasting, gifts arriving from lords across the realm. It is the moment when House Hightower's quiet, patient scheming pays off in the most visible way possible. Their bloodline is now formally, publicly, permanently tied to the Iron Throne. Without that scene, Alicent's rise to power loses its sense of triumph. Instead of a public coronation of sorts, her position feels almost secretive, as though the marriage happened in a back room rather than in front of the entire kingdom. That absence leaves a quiet hole in both Viserys's and Alicent's arcs. A hole that later episodes can only fill with tense glances and half-finished conversations, because the moment that should have defined their union was never allowed to exist for the audience. The second Lost Wedding was never filmed at all. It was written out before production even began, and its absence is arguably more damaging to the story's foundation. This is the engagement and marriage of Rhaenyra Targaryen and Laenor Velaryon. In the show, we move almost directly from Rhaenyra agreeing to the match to the wedding ceremony itself. There is no real courtship, no public betrothal feast. No extended period where the two families negotiate terms, where the realm watches the alliance being built in real time. The book, this engagement period, is a genuinely important political event stretched over months. Rhaenyra and Laenor are presented publicly, again and again, as the future king consort and queen. This is the stretch of time during which Corlys Velaryon extracts real concessions from the crown, during which the alliance between House Targaryen and House Velaryon is not just agreed upon privately but celebrated openly, in front of lords who will later be asked to honor it with their loyalty. By skipping straight to the wedding, the show robs the audience of understanding just how publicly, deliberately, and visibly this alliance was constructed. When the Velaryons later waver during the war, the betrayal in the book carries the weight of a sacred, publicly witnessed oath being broken. In the show, without that ceremony and courtship ever shown, the alliance already feels conditional and fragile from the very beginning, which makes the eventual fracture feel less like betrayal and more like an entirely predictable shift in loyalty. There's a smaller, more personal cost buried in the same decision. In the book, the engagement period gives Rhaenyra and Lenor time to build something resembling genuine affection, or at least a working friendship, an understanding between two people who both know their marriage is primarily political. In the show, they are practically strangers standing at the altar, and their wedding night reflects that. Awkward, distant, uncomfortable. That flattens the tragedy of their relationship rather than deepening it. If the audience had seen them share even one unguarded, genuine moment, later events involving Lenor would land with far more emotional weight. Daemon's missing decade. Of all the gaps left by the show's use of time jumps, none is larger or more consequential than the years Daemon Targaryen spent away from Westeros with his second wife, Lena Velaryon. When we meet them in the show, they are already married, already living in Pentos, and already parents to 2 young daughters. The wedding is never shown. The births of their daughters are never shown. An entire decade of Daemon's personal life, arguably the most emotionally significant stretch of his adult life, simply doesn't exist on screen. In the book, this wedding is a genuine event, presided over by the Prince of Pentos himself in a lavish ceremony befitting 2 of the most prominent dragon riders alive. Lena is not a passive figure in this marriage. She is the daughter of the Sea Snake, a skilled dragon rider in her own right, with her own ambitions and her own fire to match Daemon's. Their union functions as a political alliance between the Targaryens and the Velaryons, certainly, but the book frames it as something closer to a genuine love match. Arguably the only relationship in Daemon's life built on something other than politics or obsession. None of the ceremony survives into the show. We don't see the vows exchanged under the Pentoshi sun. We don't see the days-long feast that followed. We don't see the small, human detail of Daemon placing a dragon-shaped brooch on Lena's shoulder as a private promise of fidelity. Lena simply appears, already established as his wife, with no context for how they came together at all. Then come the births of their twin daughters, Baela and Rhaena. In the book, both girls are born in Pentos, each with a dragon egg placed in her cradle according to Targaryen tradition. Daemon is present for both deliveries, a small but meaningful detail, since it's one of the rare moments in the source material where Daemon is shown as genuinely present and invested in fatherhood rather than distracted by ambition. He names both daughters after legendary Valyrian warrior queens and swears to protect them. The show skips this entirely. Baela and Rhaena simply appear as children during a later time jump, their personalities already formed, their relationships with their parents already established off-screen. The audience never gets to see them as infants. We never witness the bond between father and daughters actually forming. We're simply told implicitly that it exists. Beyond the wedding and the births, the show omits the entire texture of what fans of the books often call the Pentos period. The years Daemon and Lena spent living together in a sprawling manor overlooking the harbor, surrounded by palm trees and the scent of salt and spice drifting up from the docks. In the book, Daemon spends these years flying caraxes over the Rhoyne, training with sellswords and quietly plotting his next move regarding the Stepstones, while Lena keeps her own court, raises their daughters and rides her own dragon, Vhagar. By every account in the source material, this is the closest Daemon ever comes to genuine contentment. The show omits all of it. We never see Daemon at peace, building something resembling an ordinary life outside the long shadow of his brother's throne. Instead, his eventual return to Westeros feels abrupt, his character arc disjointed, a hardened man who reappears without us ever having watched the experiences that hardened him. This matters enormously for how later choices land emotionally. His eventual coldness toward Rhaenyra, his distance from his own daughters, his willingness to leave Lena behind, all of it reads very differently depending on whether you've seen the man who was, for one stretch of years, genuinely happy. Without that context, his later choices feel less like tragedy and more like convenient plot mechanics. Nettles, the girl the show erased. Of everything cut from fire and blood on its way to the screen, nothing compares in scale or significance to the complete removal of a single character, Nettles. To understand why her absence matters so much, you have to understand what she represents in the source material. Every dragon rider we meet in the show or the books, without exception, carries Targaryen or Valyrian blood in some form. Even the lowborn Dragonseeds recruited later in the war still trace their lineage back to some forgotten Targaryen ancestor. For generations, the Maesters of the Citadel had assumed that the ability to bond with a dragon was fundamentally a matter of inheritance, a mystical trait passed down through the silver-haired nobility of Valyria. It was, in effect, the foundational myth on which Targaryen exceptionalism rested. Dragons obey us because we are special, and we are special because dragons obey us. Nettles breaks that myth entirely. In the book, she appears during the height of the war as a young woman of perhaps 15 or 16, living near the God's Eye. She has dark hair and dark skin, a striking, deliberate contrast to the pale, silver-haired heirs of Valyria, and crucially no known father and no claim whatsoever to dragon blood. When the Blacks put out an open call for anyone brave enough to attempt to claim one of Dragonstone's unclaimed dragons, several Dragonseeds with actual Targaryen ancestry approach a wild, dangerous, ancient dragon named Sheepstealer, so called because he has survived for decades in the wild by stealing sheep from local farmers. Every one of them is burned alive or eaten for the attempt. Then Nettles tries something different, rather than approaching Sheepstealer with commands or displays of dominance. She simply observes him from a distance for weeks, learning his patterns and habits. She begins leaving fresh mutton at the edge of his territory day after day, asking nothing in return. Eventually, when the dragon finally allows her to approach, she doesn't try to control him. She simply climbs onto his back and holds on. It is not a bond built on inherited blood. It is a bond built entirely on patience and trust, and in that single act, the book quietly dismantles everything the Targaryens had ever believed about their own supposed uniqueness. The show cut her from the story completely. Not a single frame of her exists on screen. Her pieces were instead scattered across other characters and plotlines. The act of bonding with a wild dragon was reassigned to a different character entirely. A separate romantic subplot was invented for another character in her place. And the mystery of Sheepstealer, a dragon who in the book is never truly tamed so much as persuaded to cooperate, became a much simpler plot device serving a different storyline altogether. Her erasure cost the story more than just one character. In the book, Nettles also develops a quiet, tender relationship with Prince Jacaery's Jace Velaryon, Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir. Jace, despite his position, is a young man constantly undermined by persistent rumors questioning his true parentage, whispers that he is not actually a Targaryen by blood at all. Nettles, lower still in status than Jace, with no name, no house, and no future to speak of, understands what it feels like to be treated as illegitimate in a world obsessed with bloodlines. The book hints at a slow, careful bond growing between them, quiet conversations near the dragon pits, shared glances during tense war councils, an unspoken affection that could never be acknowledged publicly given who they were. None of this survives into the show. Jace's emotional arc on screen is instead centered almost entirely on duty, his mother, and a betrayal involving a different character, leaving him as a more dutiful but noticeably more hollow figure than his book counterpart. A young man defined by strategic decisions rather than by a genuine, quietly rebellious love story. There is also something larger at stake in Nettles' removal, beyond any single relationship. The Dance of the Dragons, as told in the book, is fundamentally a war fought by the aristocracy over a throne, but the actual cost of that war is paid disproportionately by ordinary people who have no stake in the outcome at all. Nettles, as a character, is the story's clearest reminder of that fact. A commoner who proves that dragons don't care about bloodlines, that the natural order the highborn characters take for granted is, in fact, an illusion. Removing her from the adaptation doesn't just remove one subplot. It removes the story's single strongest challenge to the idea that Targaryen blood entitles anyone to anything at all. The merger with Rhaena. Rather than simply cutting the character and moving on, the show made a more deliberate creative choice. It folded Nettles' central achievement, bonding with the wild dragon Sheepstealer, into an existing royal character, Daemon's own daughter, Rhaena. In the book, Rhaena is the quieter of Daemon and Lynna's twin daughters. She never claims a dragon of her own during the war at all. Instead, she is sent to the Vale for her own safety and later becomes known for quiet resilience rather than dragon-riding glory, eventually becoming the Lady of the Eyrie. The show rewrites this arc almost entirely, giving Rhaena the exact dragon-taming journey that, in the source material, belonged to Nettles. This is not a small creative liberty. In the book, Sheepstealer's story exists specifically to prove that the Targaryen monopoly on dragon riding is a lie. By transferring that exact achievement to a legitimate pureblood member of the Targaryen family, the show effectively reverses the point the book was making. Instead of demonstrating that blood doesn't matter, the adaptation ends up reaffirming that it does. Rhaena's success with Sheepstealer becomes just one more validation of the family's supposed birthright, rather than a challenge to it. It's easy to see the appeal of this choice from a production standpoint. Merging two characters simplifies an already enormous cast, and it gives an existing character with an established emotional arc: Rhaenyra's isolation, her longing for a dragon of her own, her feeling of being overlooked within her own family, a satisfying payoff. But it also represents a quiet retreat from one of the book's more genuinely radical ideas. In the source material, Nettles remains a wildcard until the very end. Her fate after the war is deliberately left ambiguous, and that ambiguity is part of what makes her powerful. Rhaenyra's arc, by contrast, is safe, familiar, and firmly contained within the family's own bloodline. There is no mystery left and no threat to the established order. The gay abandon and the lost prince. Another significant piece of the story that the show has, so far, chosen to leave in deliberate fog involves the fate of two of Rhaenyra's younger sons. In the book, as the war closes in around King's Landing, Rhaenyra sends her son Prince Aegon the Younger, then barely a teenager, and his toddler brother Viserys aboard a ship named, with grim irony, the Gay Abandon, intending to get them safely across the narrow sea to Pentos. The ship never reaches its destination. It is intercepted by the Triarchy fleet, now under the command of the ruthless Admiral Shirako Lohar. Prince Aegon manages to escape on his young dragon, though the dragon is wounded in the process. His baby brother Viserys is not so fortunate. He is captured and held prisoner for years, paraded in front of Triarchy captains as a bargaining chip, his sense of his own identity slowly eroding in captivity. The show has handled this event with deliberate ambiguity so far. We are given a brief suggestion of danger, a quick glimpse of Aegon and his dragon escaping, but the actual capture of young Viserys has not been shown directly, and as of now it remains unresolved on screen. That ambiguity fundamentally changes the emotional weight of this storyline. In the book, Rhaenyra knows precisely what happened to her youngest son. He is alive but held captive, utterly beyond her reach. That specific, concrete horror feeds directly into her growing desperation and paranoia over the course of the war. In the show, by leaving the capture unconfirmed, that specific driver of her fear and desperation simply isn't there yet, which means whatever storyline eventually resolves this thread will have to do a lot of work to catch the audience up emotionally. This ambiguity also affects how the show can use Admiral Shirako Lohar going forward. In the book, he's the man personally responsible for capturing and ransoming young Viserys, which makes him a genuinely menacing figure well before the war's climax. Introduced in Season 2 without that defining act attached to him yet, his role in the story remains something of an open question. He may still go on to capture the young prince, or the show may choose an entirely different path. Either way, the emotional foundation the book built around that abduction is, for now, missing from the adaptation. There's a quieter loss buried in the same decision, too. The show has spent real time developing the next generation of dragon riders, Jace, Luke, Joffrey, Aegon, and Viserys among them. But so far it has avoided forcing the audience to confront the specific cruelty of what war does to children. The book doesn't flinch from that. It gives us a captured toddler, stripped of his name and his memory, treated as a bargaining chip by grown men fighting over a throne he can't even understand yet. By keeping Viserys' fate suspended in the show, that confrontation is postponed. It may be a safer storytelling choice for now, but the Dance of the Dragons, as written, was never really built on safety. The battle that was delayed. Perhaps the single most consequential structural change the show has made involves the Battle of the Gullet, the war's bloodiest naval engagement, and the moment in the book when everything changes for Rhaenyra personally. In the source material, this battle arrives relatively early in the war. A captured and tortured lord escapes to the free cities and secures the Triarchy's fleet for the Green's cause. That fleet sails for the Gullet, the narrow stretch of water between Dragonstone and Driftmark, catching Lord Corlys Velarion's navy, the largest in Westeros, badly off guard. The resulting battle is described as the single bloodiest naval engagement of the entire war, with dragonfire raining down and thousands of casualties on both sides. At the center of the carnage, Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir, Prince Jace, rides his dragon into the fight and is overwhelmed. Both dragon and rider fall into the sea and his body is never recovered. This loss shatters Rhaenyra in the book. It is the moment her measured, strategic approach to the war begins to curdle into paranoia and desperation, the first of several devastating personal losses that push her toward the more ruthless, suspicious version of herself we eventually see by the war's end. The show has moved this entire battle from Season 2 to Season 3, reportedly for a mix of reasons. The sheer scale and cost of rendering a naval battle of that size with dragons and hundreds of ships involved, and a deliberate choice to devote Season 2 instead to the recruitment of the Dragonseeds, the lowborn riders claiming Dragonstone's unclaimed dragons, a storyline the writers clearly wanted to establish as the emotional and structural center of that season. The consequence of this delay is a fundamental shift in the packing of Rhaenyra's emotional collapse. In the book, Jace's death happens early enough to directly catalyze her desperate, high-risk decision to recruit Dragonseeds in the first place. Grief and strategy are intertwined from the very beginning. By separating these two events, the show changes that underlying logic. Its version of Rhaenyra recruits the Dragonseeds out of practical necessity rather than raw grief, and remains, for now, a more measured, more controlled figure than her book counterpart at the same point in the story. Her transformation into someone harder and more paranoid is being saved for later, which means that when the gullet finally does arrive, it will need to carry an unusually heavy emotional burden all at once. There's a further cost buried in this delay as well. In the book, the destruction at the gullet doesn't just kill Jace, it effectively annihilates Lord Corlys Velarion's naval power, sinking hundreds of ships and devastating Driftmark itself. The show, having postponed the battle, has so far only referenced this looming devastation in council room conversation rather than showing it, which means the audience has not yet felt the full weight of what this defeat is going to cost the Velaryons or the war effort more broadly. Every storyline that depends on Jace's death, the rise of a new dragon rider to fill the gap he leaves, growing suspicion toward the Dragonseeds, the slow fracturing of the Black Alliance, has effectively been pushed back along with the battle itself, meaning the show's second half is now carrying a substantial backlog of consequences still waiting to land. Betrayal and a war made smaller. The show has also reshaped the timing of one of the war's more shocking betrayals, the defection of two lowborn Dragonseed riders, Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer. In the book, this betrayal arrives suddenly, in the middle of a critical battle with no real warning. Two men who had been fighting loyally for Rhaenyra simply switch sides in the chaos, an act of raw unpredictability that reflects just how fragile loyalty built on convenience rather than conviction really is. The show has instead chosen to build their resentment gradually from the moment they're introduced: visible discontent, mockery of the nobility, resentment at being treated as lesser despite now riding dragons. This is, in its own way, a richer character study. The audience gets to understand exactly why these men might eventually turn. But it also sacrifices the specific shock value the book relies on, the reminder that in a war fought with mercenary loyalty, betrayal can arrive without warning at all. A slow-building betrayal, however well-written, is one the audience can see coming, and stories tend to hit differently when you're braced for the blow rather than blindsided by it. This same pattern of compression runs through the show's handling of the wider war. In the book, the Dance of the Dragons isn't a contained family conflict. It's a continent-spanning civil war that drags minor lords, sellswords, and entire regions into the fighting. There is a river battle known among fans as the Fishfeed, where thousands drown in water turned red with blood. There is a brutal cavalry engagement called the Butcher's Ball. There are sieges at Storm's End and Dragonstone, and countless smaller skirmishes involving lords whose names barely survive into the history books at all. Together, these events paint a picture of a kingdom tearing itself apart from top to bottom, not just at the level of a single royal family. The show, working within the practical limits of television production, necessarily narrows this into a handful of familiar faces and a smaller number of major battles, which makes for tighter, more focused storytelling, but also shrinks the overall scale of the tragedy considerably. That narrowing has consequences that reach all the way to the story's final act. In the book, the eventual arrival of Cregan Stark to restore order in King's Landing lands as the ending of a war that has genuinely consumed the entire continent. His role is largely reactive, arriving after the fighting has already burned itself out, executing a handful of traitors before departing again. If the show's version of the war ends up feeling smaller in scope, that same sequence risks feeling less like an inevitable reckoning, and more like a tidy resolution arriving almost out of nowhere. Similarly, Rhaenyra's own fate in the book is grim and specific, a public, humiliating death by dragonfire delivered as a kind of grotesque justice. The show has already given her more agency and more moments of strength than her book counterpart, so her ending may well look different too. But whatever form it takes, its emotional impact will depend entirely on how much of the war's true cost the audience has actually been shown by the time it arrives. The cost of adapting a history book. It's worth pausing here to consider why these particular choices were made, rather than simply cataloging them. Every one of these decisions, the deleted wedding, the skipped courtship, the erased girl who tamed a dragon without royal blood, was made under real constraints. Television budgets are finite. Episode counts are finite. Audiences have limited patience for slow-burn political maneuvering when there are dragons on the poster. Given those constraints, the writers had to decide again and again which threads were essential to the emotional spine of the story and which could be trimmed away without the audience noticing too much. The trouble is that Fire and Blood wasn't built as a story with a single emotional spine. It was built as a mosaic, dozens of overlapping threads, any one of which could have carried its own adaptation. Choosing Rhaenyra and Alicent's fractured friendship as the emotional core of the show, as the writers clearly did, meant that other threads, Daemon's quiet years of contentment, Nettle's quiet defiance of the entire social order, the slow grinding attrition of a decade-long naval war, inevitably became secondary. They weren't cut because they were unimportant. They were cut because the show could only carry so much weight at once, and the writers made a bet about which weight mattered most. That bet has largely paid off in terms of the show's central relationships. Few adaptations managed to make a decade-spanning political marriage feel as personal and devastating as the unraveling of Rhaenyra and Alicent's friendship has felt on screen. But the cost of that focus is a version of the Dance of the Dragons that feels, at times, strangely intimate for a war that in the book consumed an entire continent. A handful of characters carry the emotional weight of thousands. A handful of battles stand in for a war that, on the page, never seemed to stop bleeding into every corner of Westeros. What it all adds up to. None of these individual choices are, on their own, unreasonable. Every adaptation has to compress, simplify, and choose a handful of storylines to carry the emotional weight of a much larger, messier source material. But taken together, these cuts, the deleted wedding, the skipped courtship, the missing decade in Pentos, the complete erasure of Nettles, the ambiguous fate of a kidnapped prince, the delayed battle, the softened betrayal, the narrowed scope of the wider war all point in a consistent direction. They trade scale for focus. They trade the book's sprawling, contradictory, continent-wide tragedy for a tighter, more personal family drama. As the show moves toward its climax, the real question isn't whether the adaptation is faithful to the book. It's whether enough of that original scale survives to make the ending feel as devastating as it's meant to. The book's version of this story was fueled by 1,000 small, forgotten tragedies happening all across the realm at once. The show, by necessity, has chosen to light only a few of those fires. Whether that's enough to illuminate the full weight of the Dance of the Dragons when it finally reaches its end, is something we'll only know once the story is finished being told.